This is the Big Fish Cares Podcast. Big Fish Cares Podcast. And here's your host, Benny Fisher.
I'm really excited today for our guest. He's written 31 books. He's been on the advisory board for the Western Pennsylvania Sports Museum at the Heinz History Center. He's been inducted into the Western Chapter of the Pennsylvania Sports Hall of Fame. He's won the Bob Prince Award for his journalism, the David L. Lawrence Award for promoting Pittsburgh in a positive manner on a national level, teaches classes at multiple universities over Pittsburgh. He's the first Pittsburgher to be inducted into the U.S. Basketball Writers Association Hall of Fame. He's also been on the nomination board for the Basketball Hall of Fame. In 2012, he was given the Lifetime Achievement Award and inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame. He also voted for 40 years as a Baseball Hall of Fame voter and is an honorary member of the U.S. Baseball Writers Association. He's been a columnist over the years for many local publications, including some national ones like the Sporting News, Philadelphia Evening Bulletin, the Miami News, and New York Post. He's also wrote stories for Newsweek, Basketball Times, the Football News, and the Washington Post. He's been married for 54 years. My dear friend, Jim O'Brien, welcome to the show.
Ben, I'm excited to be here, and I'm glad you invited me to come in and shoot the breeze about all sports. I've been around a lot of big people in sports, and I like to tell stories about them, so we're a good team.
This is fun. I remember the way we met was at a home and garden show. I feel like it was at the David L. Lawrence Convention Center probably 8 or 9 years ago, and I was sitting at a booth, and you were sitting next to me at a booth, and I was more fascinated with you and your stories and who you were than I was about, selling any type of roofing material or anything like that with customers. So I appreciate you entertaining me for that week, and I probably bugged you a bunch, but I got to know you really well, and it's been great getting to be friends with you over the last 10 years.
Well, I appreciated the fact that you were ambitious and that you were starting your own business and so forth. And I like to teach. I've often told people that I feel like I am a sports writer, but I'm really a teacher. And I love to help young people make something of themselves and get better and learn to communicate better. I have 2 daughters that are very successful, and I've told them both that it's important that they speak well and that they write well. And if they can do that, no matter what kind of a job they have, they will prosper, because that's the key to success. My 10th grade English teacher at Taylor Allardyce High School, who took an early interest in my writing, she told me, "Jimmy, you will be known for the way you speak and the company you keep." And I've tried to live up to that.
Yeah, well, it's you're a legend. You're a legend in Pittsburgh. That's
that means
for sure.
I'm getting old.
No, I mean, you have experience.
But I'm still hustling.
You are. I just bought a book for $30.
Right
out of the back of your Chrysler.
I had a meeting yesterday at Panera's with a fellow's named Anderson, Ted Anderson, the father, and Michael Anderson, the son. And they bought $300 and some worth of books from me. And when I came home, I gave it to my wife. I said, "Here, I haven't given you a paycheck for a while." I said, I always take pride in the fact that I can go out and make some money during a period when a lot of people don't want to work.
Sure, you got that right.
I've almost stopped at one of these places that have a sign hiring, because it bothers me that these people are looking for help. There's a place near me out in Washington County that washes cars. They pay $19 an hour for you to dry cars. If I wasn't worrying about risking sunburn, because the Irish are not meant to be out in the sun, $19 an hour to dry cars, I can do that.
So tell me about your journey. Where'd you grow up? Tell me about the journey of how you got into being an author, being a writer, and being one of the best storytellers that I know.
Well, the Irish have a gift for storytelling. That's one thing. There's a tradition for Irish to tell stories. So, my name should have been Brendan. There was a great Irish writer named Brendan Behan who wrote a book called The Borstal Boy. And Brendan O'Brien sounds good. It sounds like an author. When I was a kid, I was the one who determined what game we would play on the street where I lived. And the street was called Sunnyside Street. And I've often thought that it's good that it was called Sunnyside Street, because I like to think of myself as having a sunny up side disposition. And I would have all the sports equipment. So even if I were sick, the kids would be knocking on my door to borrow a football or a baseball or a basketball. I was the one who put up the hoop on the pool. Actually did it, and I'm not a handyman, but I did it in such a way that the boards stuck out over the street, and you could do a layup and go underneath of it until a furniture truck knocked it down. But the kids said they never had to worry about what they were going to play on a given day, especially in the summer, because Jim O'Brien always had something lined up for us. I had a track on my street, quarter-mile oval. I fashioned a discus from some wood chips. I built a broad jump pit. There was a lot on our street called the Horseshoe Lot, where, of course, once upon a time, men played horseshoes. And I would fix that field so that we could play ball. And it was an uneven surface, and it had a sewer line that ran up through the middle of it and everything else. And a ball hit into somebody's yard would be a double, and into the next yard would be a home run. But I determined all that. And then one day I start writing little stories about what we were doing. And then I started sliding them under the door of the local weekly newspaper.
How old were you?
14.
Wow.
And they didn't know that I was so little. I was the smallest kid on the street at my age. And first in Holy Communion, first in confirmation. The midgets were at the front of the line. The tall girls were at the back. And one day they called me and asked me if I wanted to be the sports editor of the paper. I don't think they knew I was 14. I don't think they knew I was about 4'11". And I wrote for the Hazelwood Envoy for 5 years until I became the sports editor of the Pitt News as a sophomore. I was the first non-senior to be the sports editor of the Pitt News. One of the previous sports editors was Myron Cope. And there were some good ones. B.Z. Weinstein and George Casita, one of the best sports writers ever to come out of Pittsburgh that nobody knows about, worked for the Los Angeles Times and the Philadelphia Daily News. So I just started writing. And then I met Myron Cope when I was 15.
He's the terrible towel guy, right?
He's the terrible towel guy. And he was often misused and not a particularly appreciated sports writer for the Post-Gazette. Al Abrams, the sports editor, kept him buried. And it's a shame because most of the people on his staff couldn't write. But Myron was the best, and he wrote well enough to get assignments from Sports Illustrated and Collier's and True Magazine and stuff like that. So one day when I was 15, I met him at the Pitt Fieldhouse. He was covering the Golden Gloves, and that was his top assignment. And it was my top assignment because I lived in Hazelwood and Glenwood, and the Glen Hazel Boys Club was the best boxing team in the city of Pittsburgh for 12 years. So I said, Mr. Cope, what do I have to do to become a writer? And he said, kid, you got to sit down and start writing. The best advice I ever got. Because even now, it won't happen by itself. You have to sit down and start writing. And I was fortunate that writing has always been easy for me. Now, some people say it's difficult.
You don't get writer's block?
No.
That's not a thing?
No. Bob Smizek, a friend of mine, tells me that it's hard to write. And I know writers who boast about sweating blood and tears. Red Smith, one of the finest, did that. Maybe I would be a better writer if I worked harder at it, but maybe I wouldn't write if it were hard to do. I don't sleep well all the time because I'm thinking of sentences. I'm actually, I don't know music. I don't know how to write music, but I appreciate music. And I like to think that my writing has a certain rhythm to it. I like subtle alliteration. And this past year, a friend of mine, invited me to a sing-along. And no one has ever, in 79 years, invited me to a sing-along because I can't sing. I do a Milli Vanilli, I pretend like I'm singing.
A little lip-sync action.
Even in church, I stand next to a good singer and pretend like I'm singing. But she had some songs by Billy Joel and also by Neil Diamond. And she had them on the screen in the front of the room so that people could read the words. And I had sort of an epiphany because I noticed that they weren't sentences. They were just images. Throw out 2 or 3 words, sounds. And all of a sudden I started to, in my late 70s, incorporate that into my own writing because I had these images and I had these sounds. And so you can never stop learning. I read a lot. My wife, I'm lucky, I'm married to a woman who's bright and puts up with me. And she reads about 40 to 45 books a year.
Wow.
Doesn't read the same books I read. But she recently did read a book that I read. I read a book that was so good that I read it in 7 straight hours.
What book?
The book is called Out of the Blue.
What's it about?
And the writer's name is Bernstein. He works for the New York Times. And it's a book about 9/11. And what I like about it is it's so personal. He writes about people on both sides of the equation on 9/11. I mean, he introduces the skyjackers, for instance, and who they were and what they were all about and what their background was and their training. And the book really, it's so insightful about what happened. And I had lunch one day at the top of one of the towers at the windows on the World. In fact, we were with Bob Smizek and his wife Nancy. We had introduced them. Nancy had been a roommate of my wife in grad school at Pitt. So we were in that room, and that particular morning, there were people from 40 different countries who were in the room, the windows on the World. And they were all killed. And when I saw that image of the building just dissolving into dust, I mean, it was something you'll just never forget, you know.
Where were you at that day?
I was typing at the computer in my home in Upper St. Clair. My next door neighbor called me, Claudia Franiuti. She called me, she said, turn on the television. And I was just with a woman the other day who was a teacher and told me that with the school where she was teaching, they were told, don't turn on the TV. They did not want the children in the school to see the images because they thought it would be terrifying for them. And I wonder about that because, in fact, I asked her, I said, have you ever had any second thoughts about that decision that someone made for you, you know, that you didn't get to see it? Kids grow up, and I know, for instance, myself, I'll never forget where I was when Bill Mazeroski hit the home run to win the World Series in 1960. I was a freshman at Pitt, and I was in the student union.
Just tell me about Pitt a little bit, because
Well, one other part of that was I was on the same street when I learned that JFK had been slain on the streets of Dallas.
On Sunnyside Street?
No, on Forbes Avenue.
Forbes Avenue. So you were actually at Pitt.
I was at Pitt.
So you actually stayed. So you went from Hazelwood to Pitt. Did you actually? And you stayed on campus?
No.
No.
Wasn't that wealthy. I did have a scholarship. Elsie Hillman knew my mother, and Elsie Hillman was the chairman of the Republican Party for Western Pennsylvania. So I went to Pitt with a half scholarship, and then my sophomore year I got the other half by being the sports editor of the Pitt News.
That's really cool. My new business partner, Rob Tokay, who just came on board in April, he's from Hazelwood. And you two are the two people that are the closest to me that I know from Hazel. But I've always heard that there's been a lot of good people that come out of Hazelwood. And I like people that come out of Hazelwood because they're always tough. And I feel like, I don't know, does Hazelwood have a little reputation for being tough?
Well, I told you that I covered the Glen Hazel Boys Club in boxing because they were the best team. They imported boxers from Homestead and from the Hill District and so forth. But when I was a young teenager, I went to the Glen Hazel Boys Club and took boxing lessons for about 2 years, not because I wanted to be a boxer, because I wanted to survive the streets of Hazelwood and Glenwood. When you were a teenager, You knew who in the neighborhood you could beat in a fight. You knew who you couldn't beat, and you knew what was a toss-up. And it was like Ring magazine ratings or something. You knew where you stood in the pecking order. And sometimes we wrestled and boxed in local garages on urine-stained mattresses and so forth.
Were people betting money on you?
I don't know about that.
Yeah, no.
That's something I don't do. My everybody in my family bet on the numbers, and my mother loved to play bingo. My sister played bingo. My brothers all bet on sports. And that's something that right now I think is a real danger in this country, because you can't turn on a sports event today without being bombarded with ads relating to sports betting.
Yeah.
And they're telling you about how easy it is to win money. And I know better. It's easy to lose money.
Yeah.
And the more you know about sports, and I think I know a little bit about sports.
I would say so.
The more you know, the less you know.
As far as predicting the outcome with spreads and stuff, oh, absolutely.
Right.
When you went to Pitt, what did you study English and writing, or like what was that?
Well, I started out as a journalism student, and I realized after one term, being taught by fellows that worked at the Post-Gazette and the Sun-Telegraph and so forth, I had learned on the job what they were teaching me. So I switched and became an English writing major. And that was a wise decision, because in my lifetime, I've worked for ad agencies, I've written copy, I've written comic strips, I've done newsletters, flyers, any way that you can communicate, I've done it. And sometimes all at the same time. I mean, I used to have 3 jobs. I was like Stan Savran. If I didn't have 3 jobs, I got nervous. But when I was in New York, for instance, I worked at the New York Post, the largest evening paper in the country.
Did you go there after college?
Yes.
Okay.
Not directly. Bino Cook and I had this newspaper called Pittsburgh Weekly Sports for 5 years. And I was the editor, and Bino was the business manager, which is a bit of a joke. Bino used to pay people by endorsing checks. He'd just sign a check and hand it to them. But he introduced me to the best writers in the country, which later led to jobs at the best newspapers in the country. And better yet, when I was 18, Bino got me into the stock market.
Wow.
And I've been in it ever since.
What year would that be? Tell me, give the people at home a reference.
1962.
Okay,
1962.
So you're coming out of high school, and it's in the early 60s.
Right.
Okay.
I went to Taylor Alderdice High School in Squirrel Hill.
All right.
And I entertained the students at Taylor Alderdice. I mean, I can remember in public speaking class. I learned a lot at Alderdice. I started out at Central Catholic. And I was there for a year and a half. And I was in the best class there, 1F and 1S. And you got into those classes by, taking an evaluation test. So I was one of the smart kids at Central Catholic. But in my sophomore year, I asked the moderator of the student newspaper why my story, which was quite lengthy, did not have a byline.
What's a byline?
By Jim O'Brien.
Okay.
In the Viking newspaper.
All right.
He hauled off and slapped me in the face. Just slapped me in the face. Brother Emery, Francis Emery, I'll never forget him. And one of my classmates to this day can't believe that he hit me, but I wouldn't make it up. He hit me, and I went to a phone on the wall, which dates me as well. And I called my mother, and I said, Mom, I'm out of here. I'm going to Alderdice. That's where I wanted to go in the first place. That's where I'm going. And the thing I lacked at Alderdice was the discipline that I required, and you had whether you liked it or not at Central Catholic. But I had really good teachers at Taylor Alderdice High School, and there were a preponderance, and I hope this is politically correct, but to me it's a tribute. I knew that there were a lot of Jewish students at Taylor Alderdice, maybe 60%, and they cared about school. And they cared, and they were expected by their parents to excel in school. So I benefited from the company I was keeping. And the classes that I had, that I still they still resonate with me, is public speaking, speed reading, which they don't teach anymore, and I benefit from that. That's how I read that out of the blue in 7 straight hours. Typing. I had a hard time getting grades in typing, but I can type as fast as most secretaries in Pittsburgh. And I've made a living. I've made a living using my adroit dancing fingers. I had a class in history that was especially good by a man named Sam Blitz. I mean, how many people my age remember their school teachers by name? And Miss Kerensky was my typing teacher. And she used to wear these shoes that had tread on them like a John Deere tractor. She had fallen as a teacher early and banged her head on the blackboard and told us that one day. And I laughed when she told the story. And she said one day she was threatened to leap over her desk and strangle me in class. Fortunately, she couldn't leap. But I saw her years later in downtown Pittsburgh in front of the Horns building, and it was raining, and there were puddles in the street. And she was walking in the puddles with those shoes. And I thought, this makes sense. It finally makes sense that she has these shoes on. And I stopped her on the sidewalk, and I said, Miss Skorinsky, I don't expect you to remember me, but I want to thank you for teaching me how to type. I said, I've made a good living as a result of your efforts, and I know that you wanted to kill me, but I want to thank you. And that's one thing I think that's important to do, is thank people. Thank people who've helped you. I think I'm big on that. Another thing I like to do is it's easy to be a good guy, and I surround myself with good guys these days. A friend of mine came up to me about 6 years ago, and he said, you always go to lunch with really good people. He said, why don't we start a lunch club? And I said, what, for good guys? And he said, yeah, good guys. And one of the things that I've done in the 6 years is I try to impress upon them the need for us all to work at being good guys. It's easy enough. I mean, people let the door fly when you're walking into a store. I don't let the door fly,
You're a gentleman.
I'm a gentleman.
And a scholar.
And a scholar.
I remember when you started that, you actually invited me. I think I was at the first one, or maybe you were doing them at Fridays over in South Hills Village, and they were kind of just starting to take off. Then when you moved to Atria's in over by your house in Waterdam, that's when they really were more like, there was 50 people there every single time. You couldn't get a seat. I mean, it was packed. And then I think then COVID came, and I feel like it's probably not.
Yeah, that hurt us. That hurt us. But I have one coming up soon, and there'll be about 48 people. We'll be filling the club room, and I may even have to move it to the main dining room.
That's right. When I started the Big Fish Contracting Company, it was in 2015. I remember coming to a couple of events because I was, the young whippersnapper business guy just trying to meet a bunch of people. You introduced me to Art Rooney's brother.
Art Rooney Jr.
Or Art Rooney Jr. I get confused with all the Rooneys because I'm from Canton, Ohio. I just moved here 11 years ago, so I'm still trying to figure out, and I hate the Steelers because I'm a Browns fan, but I respect the Steelers. I'm always trying to learn about stuff, but the whole Rooney thing it's hard for me to kind of keep track of all of them. And I also met, I have a picture with Andy Russell. That was really cool. Who else did we meet?
Well, like Eddie Johnson comes to
Eddie Johnson. He's the one with the ring,
Right.
the Pittsburgh Penguin ring.
He comes to all the luncheons. Andy Russell comes to all the luncheons. Frank Thomas, the original Frank Thomas.
Yeah, not the guy that played for the White Sox back in the 90s.
Frank wants to come to the luncheons on a regular basis. And I've had, in the 6 years, I've had over 100 speakers. I've had Hall of Famers such as Rocky Bleier and Franco Harris and Dwayne Woodruff and Mel Blount, and I've had. I'm working right now to get one of my former students at Point Park University to come, and he wants to come, but his schedule gets crazy, so he's trying to make sure that he can come, and that's Bob Pompiani.
Ah, all right. Yeah, I've seen Bob at a couple charity events and stuff like that.
And you told me that when we do this podcast that, whatever comes up, let's say something about it. Bob Pompiani was a student of mine at Point Park University in a communications class. And he was an intern at the same time at the KDKA. So one of the things I did for him was he would do tape-recorded interviews, and I would have him play it for me and so forth, and I would tell him what I thought about it. And he was a bright young man, and bright-eyed. You know, I always used to tell my daughters, don't bring anybody home that doesn't have a gleam in their eye, because they can't get anything done. And Bob Pompiani was the kind of young man that I just embraced. And he has an internship at KDKA Television while he's a student at Point Park. His mother wants him to quit the job at KDKA because he's not getting the grades at Point Park that she thought that he should be getting. So Bob tells me this. He was in a woeful mood as he expressed what his mother had said. And I said, get your mother and bring her into class. I need to talk to her. And I met Mrs. Pompiani, and I said, Mrs. Pompiani, I said, Bob already has the job he wants to do for the rest of his life. That was 40-some years ago. He didn't leave KDKA. He stayed there. He had his foot in the door. I mean, internships are so important in that regard. And I've always promoted young people. When I worked at Pitt, I had about a dozen students, men and women, who've come into great jobs in public relations and newspapers and magazines and so forth. And I tutored them. And actually, you know, they did a lot of my work. They told me that they did all the dirty work and made me look good. Well, they found out my secret. And I'm so proud of them. I mean, Pat Hanlon, for instance. I don't know if you ever heard of Pat Hanlon. Pat Hanlon was an intern at the Pittsburgh Press when I worked there. And every time I asked Pat Hanlon to do something for me, he did it. He did it right away, and he'd come back and say, what do you want me to do next?
Yeah, next. Yeah, it's good.
And Pat was at Pitt when I went there, and he was my first hire. I'm proud of that. He was my first hire. And I helped him. I promoted him to the University of Oklahoma and West Virginia. He got jobs. And then I promoted him to the Steelers, and he became the assistant public relations man. And then he went from there to the New England Patriots, and he went from there to the New York Football Giants. And Pat Hanlon is an executive vice president of the New York Giants. He makes about $250,000 a year. And he's been with him for a long, long time. He's good at what he does. He has a great personality. So he was a real ally for me. He did make me look good. And I think it's important when you hire people that you can mold, that you can teach. But they've got to have that gleam in their eye.
Absolutely.
You had the gleam in your eye when I first met you, which is part of your appeal.
I hope I still have the gleam in my eye.
You do, especially when women walk by.
It's really important because I feel like I interview people all the time. That's pretty much all I do anymore is like interview and help with the marketing department. And we're finding a lot of people, and it's getting tough out there because you get 100 people that send a resume in. You ask for 10 of them to show up for an interview. 7 of them say they're going to come. Only 5 actually show up. You only really like 3 of them. You try to hire 2 of them. 1 doesn't show up on their first day, and the other one quits after 90 days. So that's out of 100. And it's getting tougher and tougher. And I keep seeing on resumes, one of the things that my mom taught me when I was young was don't quit a job until you have another job.
Exactly.
Right? Rule number 1, right? You know? And I see all these gaps like all over the place. And I'm just like, what have you been doing? And they're like, oh, well, I just haven't found what I'm looking for. I'm like, yeah, well, how do you pay for things?
Yeah, get a job. It may not be the job, but get a job until you get the job.
Yeah. And
my younger daughter, Rebecca, who's about 44, 45 years old, she lost her job at the outset of the pandemic in the restaurant business. She had an executive position, but it was in a position that was expendable during tough times. Had she remained a general manager of the restaurant, which she did for many years, she would not have been let go, but she was not in an essential position, and she cost a lot of money. So I've tried to get her to to get a job. And she's being interviewed right now. And I just said to her yesterday, I said, you cannot have a better resume than you have in the restaurant business. I mean, she was the operator of the year 2 out of 3 years for California Pizza Kitchen, which is an international chain. The best. She was the best at running a restaurant.
It doesn't surprise me if she's coming from the Jim O'Brien bloodline.
Well, she told her mother, she says, Dad's always telling me how to do my work, and I went to college for hotel and restaurant management. And my wife said, your dad spends a lot of time in restaurants. You know, people that are hosts in restaurants or hostess, I wonder if anybody gave them a job description. They don't smile. They don't greet you by name even though you're a regular customer. They don't clean up after somebody else. You know, somebody told me that when you work in a restaurant, that if you're not serving someone, you should serve someone who is. And what that means, of course, is that one of your coworkers is getting something in the kitchen and there's some dirty dishes on his table or her table. Pick them up. Make yourself useful. And I was lucky as a young man Frankie Gustine, who had played for the Pittsburgh Pirates, owned a restaurant in Oakland near Forbes Field. A very popular restaurant for over 30 years. And Frankie Gustine knew his customers. I'm always impressed when I see the owner of a restaurant taking the time to go around the tables and say something to each of the customers. If I owned a restaurant, I would touch every customer who comes in the restaurant.
That's our personality. Yeah. We like that part.
I would like them to know that I appreciate their business. You know, my father, I've always said that this is where I got my work mantra. I didn't realize how long the Depression was. You know, I thought maybe it was 2 or 3 years. It was like 7 or 8 years, the Great Depression.
That was like, what, in the 20s?
Yeah, and my father didn't have a job during that period of time, but not a regular job. And he went out, my mother told me this, he went out every day and knocked on doors. You need something done. Is there something I can fix? Is there, your yard need cleaned up? Whatever they wanted, he'd do.
Problem solver.
And he prided himself on coming home with some money in his pocket. And that's kind of me. I was a newspaper delivery boy for the Post-Gazette when I was a kid. And I was good at it. And the thing about that is I learned everything you need to know to be successful in business. One, you got to get up earlier than everybody else. You have to go out in bad weather. I hated it whenever it was lightning. Oh, that was the worst. Running from door to door. You had to knock on people's doors, and many of my customers were different ethnic groups, and I had to knock on the door, and sometimes for 3 weeks to get paid. I had to be responsible for the money I collected. I couldn't lose it, couldn't blow it. And I remember when I played pinball machines as a kid, one of my best friends played for hours. I just played until I lost about a quarter or something like that. I didn't want to lose money. And I learned as a kid how to hustle. And it serves you well the rest of your life. And I enjoy it. See, that's the other thing. I enjoy writing. It's a gift. It's a gift. And I recognize that it's a gift.
When we have a generation right now of kids or people that don't have a whole lot of hustle in them, it doesn't seem like, do you think you can teach hustle? Or do you think hustle's something that you're born with?
That's a good question. I have a writing group at my church, and about 25 people. They're all over 65. My best writer's 96. I love her, Betty Digby. You're
a young buck compared to her, yeah.
Yeah, she loves me. And I don't think I teach people how to write, but I make it easier for them to write. I think teachers in school, with the essays and the term paper, and I think they make it scary. And I just get the words down on paper. Like Myron Cope told me, just sit down and start writing. Get your stories into the machine, or today into your computer or your iPhone or what have you. And I like to do that. I like to motivate people. And I think one of the things that I did when I worked at Pitt was I had interns. And when I go out there, they had 2 interns in the department. And they made them feel like they'd gotten into Harvard. I had 20-some interns. Myron Cope said I had more interns than Dr. Starzl.
Who's Dr. Starzl?
One of the world's leading transplant surgeons who made his mark at Pitt.
Okay.
Probably as much as Jonas Salk, who discovered
Polio
the
vaccine.
anti-polio vaccine.
So I know that one, okay?
That's a
I
good
didn't
one.
know who Starzl was.
In the 50s. You know, there's a story, Dr. Salk, he had a building across from Pitt Stadium, right next door. And when he actually conducted his experiments of the shot, they had the Pitt football team walk across the street to his lab, and he gave them shots. And they really didn't ask the guys if they wanted to get shots or anything else.
It's kind of like today's day. We keep promoting the shot.
Right. So Dr. Salk, I think they should have a statue. There's no statue on the Pitt campus of Dr. Salk. I mean, he brought worldwide attention to the school. And during this most recent pandemic, I was hoping that the Pitt doctors would actually have the breakthrough and come up with a vaccine that would cure it. They did some major work, and they did some good things and contributed to the overall effort and the health of us, but they didn't. They weren't Moderna, they weren't Pfizer, and what's the other one, Ben? The Pfizer and Moderna.
I don't watch the news. I have no idea. I'm probably the worst at that. I have no idea.
There's a third.
But speaking of COVID, you wrote you being the older generation, you had to you were probably real protective, right? I'm sure Kathy made you stay home and not let you be out as much as you probably were used to.
No, not as much as some of my friends.
That had to be tough for you because I know you're a networking guy and you like to be out there with the people.
I wrote a book called The Strangest Season.
Yeah.
During the pandemic. That was my cure for the pandemic, to get busy and get something accomplished. And I didn't hide in the attic like Tony Kornheiser, my friend. And
you know Tony?
Oh yeah, I gave him his first assignment for a magazine.
What's the show? He's on ESPN. He does the show with
Pardon the Interruption.
Pardon the
Mike
Interruption.
Wilbon.
Yeah,
and that's what we used to do.
They're still doing that show?
Oh yeah, 20 years.
Wow, that's impressive.
That's what we're you and I are in the first year of our 20 years of doing this.
Well, you'll be 99 when we wrap it up.
Right. And hopefully I'll still be able to talk. That's the key.
So tell me about the strangest season. Tell me what it's about.
You know who that is?
That looks like Mike Tomlin with a face mask on.
Right.
Yeah.
And it kind of captures the idea of, the Steelers mask, and you can see his eyes, and they look concerned, which they should have. It was a strange period, this 2020, 2021, and maybe it'll extend into 2022. A lot of weird stuff has happened in the last 2 years because of the pandemic and how it changed things, and games without a crowd. It's like if a tree falls in a forest and no one hears it, did it really fall?
Yeah, it's really hard to watch sports without people in the stadium.
Exactly,
yeah.
And there were 8 Hall of Fame baseball players who died during that 2-year period. 8. Should have been 9. Richie Allen died.
Sounds like a book that you could write.
Yeah.
Should have been 9.
Should have been a Hall of Famer, but Richie was difficult with people. He's from Wampum, PA, in western Pennsylvania. Was there when Don Hennon was on the basketball team and the Allen brothers were on the sports teams. And Richie was difficult with the writers, and they got their revenge by not voting for him. See, I never did that. During the 40 years that I voted for the Hall of Fame, for instance, I would have voted for Barry Bonds. Jerk, yes, but great baseball player.
Yeah. You're more about what they did on the field than what they were like off the field.
Yeah, but
correct?
that's okay. I mean, that's part of the process, how you behave and so forth. And one of the people, they forgave a lot of sins of Babe Ruth for sure. But
there wasn't social media back then.
Pete Rose would have been a first ballot, but he's never been on the ballot. See, people don't understand that. Pete Rose's name has never appeared on a ballot.
Can you write him in?
you could.
But then you'd be like,
but you'd be breaking the rules.
Yeah.
And he's not eligible. He's not eligible for the Baseball Hall of Fame. And he's one of the greatest baseball players and one of the greatest competitors ever. And I interviewed him many times. One of my favorite teams to deal with was the Big Red Machine.
Joe Morgan.
Yeah, and the only guy
Griffey was on that team, right?
The only guy I didn't like was Johnny Bench.
Okay, catcher.
Jerk.
Yeah,
just a jerk. From Bangor, Oklahoma.
Is that because he wouldn't give you an interview, or is that because
In fact, it brings to mind an interview. No, he just was difficult. He didn't get it. Like he became a member of that celebrity golf tour, but he wasn't kind with the crowd.
Yeah.
They're not there to see Johnny Bench play golf. They're there because he's a celebrity. And that's something that, we were lucky. We had Arnold Palmer. Arnold Palmer was the best at dealing with the public and so forth. And he didn't come by it naturally. He just worked at it. And you pay attention to people like that. For instance, Arnold Palmer taught Joe Namath something. Joe Namath was scribbling his signature once, and Arnold Palmer said that if someone thinks enough of you to ask you for your autograph, you ought to write it in a manner that 5 years from now, when they look at it, they know who wrote
Grab that helmet right there. Right. Check that out. It looks nice. You can see. You can actually see. You can
Joe
actually.
Namath.
Yeah, you can see it. You can read it. It's legible.
Well,
all these guys, Otto Graham, Lou Groza. I mean, they all those
favorites of mine.
All those old school guys, man. They write nice and legible for you.
Legible. Good word. Good
and then
word.
you see like LeBron James. You saw the autograph back of it's like big scribble.
Right.
Well,
the players today actually work at developing an autograph. Something.
Well, because now they can sell them for money and stuff like that.
Something fancy. But Roethlisberger's is a waste of time.
Yeah, he's got a fast one.
Lemieux used to have a good one, but he doesn't anymore. Roberto Clemente actually had two different distinctive autograph signatures. And
depends on if it was the guy in the clubhouse signing for him or if it was him signing, correct?
Well, because
there's a whole story about that.
I knew a woman
his clubhouse guy would sign autographs.
I knew a woman that worked for she was a volunteer for the Penguins, and she did all the Lemieux stuff for years, answering his stuff. And Lemieux, every so often, Lemieux can take a private jet and go to Toronto and sit down at a table at a show for 2 hours or something like that, and make $50,000, $60,000. So can Jack Lambert, just signing their name for some stuff. And Lynn Swan, that's when they got Jack Lambert, Mike Webster, and John Stallworth, and they got Jimmy Allen.
That's like half of Canton.
And Jimmy Allen,
all those guys are in Canton,
made a mistake of telling Chuck Noll, play me or trade me. Noll traded him to the Lions, whom he led in interceptions.
So they used to do those shenanigans back then like they do now? Because now they make all these crazy demands. So back then they were doing it, they probably just wasn't publicized, right? Because there's not as much, there was no ESPN back then, right?
Well, he said to me, first of all, he became a homeless person.
Who?
Jimmy Allen.
Really?
Nobody knew where he was. None of the Steelers knew where he was.
I think I remember you telling me about that when we had lunch the other day. You were telling me about Jimmy Allen, and then didn't you say you went to try to find him?
Yes. In Los Angeles.
What'd you tell your wife about that one?
Well, actually, what happened was I sent his wife a copy of the book on Jack Lambert, in which I had a chapter about the fact that Jimmy Allen was missing as a homeless person.
That's so crazy.
And it was like Don Quixote, I thought it was a fool's mission to tilt.
It's like searching for Bobby Fischer.
Right.
Yeah.
But I sent his wife a book, and he'd come home once in a while for a funeral or a birthday, and he came in the house and picked up the Lambert book, and my phone number was in there, and he called me out of the blue. And I felt like, Livingston, I presume. I felt like, my God, how could you find a homeless person? I don't know if you ever saw the book or the movie, The Soloist.
No.
With
I don't think.
Jamie Foxx. And he was a musician who as a young man, had studied at Juilliard School.
Oh, yeah, in New York. He was like, it was like, in the streets of New York,
right.
And he was like a rough, almost like homeless, yeah. And then he got found, and
right.
then went on to big things. I did see that.
A writer named Steve Lopez at the Los Angeles Times wrote a column about him, and then became a friend of his, and then sort of helped him out and so forth, and got him straightened away temporarily because he really was a mental case, but he was a gifted musician. But that inspired me to want to find him. And my daughter's boyfriend, Juan Barreo, he said to me one day, a mistake on his part, he said, "I'm yours all day tomorrow. Anything you want me to do, I'll do." I said, "I want you to take me to Victorville." And Victorville was where Jimmy Allen was living. He'd gotten his act together. He had a nice house. The NFL helped him with some money. And Victorville, by the way, was where Sammy Davis Jr. lost his eye.
The Rat Pack.
Yeah, from the Rat Pack.
Yeah.
Do you remember those?
I don't remember. No.
Those knobs on steering wheels. They had a knob, a decorative knob.
I've only been driving since like 1997,
right.
So I'm not sure.
Well,
on the shifter, you mean?
On the wheel.
On the wheel.
On the wheel. You would hold it. And it was a decorative knob. They were almost like the goalies' helmets in hockey or something like that.
No.
And he was in a wreck, and he struck his eye against that knob. They're illegal now. You're not allowed to have them.
Oh, okay. So I'm like skimming through this book real quick because this is like you wrote this during COVID, and it just came out September, October,
yes.
Just a couple months ago.
Yes.
So that's awesome. And I'm seeing all kinds of just interesting stories. I see your wife's name mentioned. You obviously mentioned Kathy in a lot of your stories because she's probably the one that has to give you permission to even go do the interview or do the story or whatever. But so I see her name. I see pictures of there's an article in here called "The 2 Memorable Days in the Summer of 1962." There's no rhyme or reason. Is it just stuff that popped into your head as you were writing during COVID and you would just write a story, huh?
Right, because it fit the theme. It fit the theme of
like the morning that you were waking up and thinking about Bill Hillgrove. I met Bill Hillgrove at one of your at lunches.
Right.
Yeah, he's an awesome guy. I got Joe Montana's autograph. I was probably 16 years old because I grew up in Canton, so my mom would drop me off at the Hall of Fame steps. This is back before we had cell phones too. Like United had to use a payphone, and we'd have a meetup spot. And she would drop me off at 8 in the morning. ESPN would be getting set up. I would get a front row seat as close as I could get. I remember sitting next to Chris Berman one year while we were watching it, and Joe Montana was leaving through the gate or whatever. I threw him a football. He signed it. Gave it back to me. I thought that was pretty cool. So my interaction with Joe Montana was always pretty cool. But
I think that's important.
Yeah,
I think you should judge people by the way they treat you.
Yeah, no, and I do. I mean, that's another life lesson. We should probably do a whole podcast after this is all wrapped up of life lessons with Jim O'Brien.
Well, I'll tell you, the thing about athletes is I never genuflected in front of an athlete or a ball player.
Tell me what that means again.
Genuflect.
Yeah, go ahead. That's a word. I dropped out of college, so
take a knee, but not like Colin Kaepernick. It's when you go into a Catholic church, for instance, and you're in the aisle, you genuflect and you toward the altar. So that's
so you never acted like you were impressed with these guys because you got to go in as a writer, right? Is that what you mean?
No, I didn't bow before them.
Right,
but I respected them.
Right.
I respected them, and
it was professional for you. You're a writer.
They had to trust me.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had situations where just this past year I interviewed Adam Frazier, who was my favorite pirate, and I was warned not to get too caught up with him because he wouldn't be there long, and that proved right. But Adam Frazier, I talked to him on a phone at a hotel when he was on the road, and he didn't know me, but I had met him the day that he reported to the Pirates. I met him in a hotel in Indianapolis where I was interviewing basketball players. He had a bag, and he was checking out, and it said Pirates on it. I said, "Do you play for the Pirates?" He said, "I hope so." And he smiled, and he was going to report to the Pirates, and he stayed with the team ever since. But I had to establish, and I've done this several times, I had about 5 minutes, the way I see it, to establish a relationship on the phone where he knew that I knew what I was talking about and that I wasn't a jerk. I wasn't a fan, just a stupid, person. And that's a skill. That's a skill set of being able to make them realize. I told him for openers, I said, do you know that he had just made this great play behind shortstop for the Pirates where he did a spin and threw the first base for an out. And it was a great, great play. And I said to him, you know that you did something that Ozzie Smith never did,
The Wizard.
that Billy Mazeroski never did. I said, Maz wasn't fast enough to get to where you got to. That's one thing. I said, but if he had, he would have made the play. But I said, you did something Mazeroski never did. You did something Ozzie Smith never did. Well, if you're Adam Frazier and someone tells you that, you have to like them. And what I said was, you were able to watch that play over and over and over and over on your phone. They couldn't do that. You could see that. And he admitted that he had watched it a lot. No wonder, because it was such a fantastic play. But
So that's how you hooked him, though. You hooked him by giving him something that nobody else has brought to his attention. You were creative enough to figure that out through all your history of sports, and you package that up to get to your favorite player, and then boom, you got your interview.
right.
Yeah. No, that's resourceful.
And then he told me, I asked him, someone said, well, how do you do an interview without asking him the questions everybody asks him? I said to him, what are you reading? And he was reading a book about 12 Rules of Life.
Yeah, Jordan Peterson.
Right.
Oh, great book.
And I
book.
went to a bookstore the next day and got the book and read it so I would know what he was reading and what he was thinking. And it shows you that here's a baseball player that is examining himself, wants to be the best he can be. And you learn something like that. And the other thing I did at the end of the interview was I thanked him. I'm thinking right now I got to call a football player who's ill.
Well, listen, you're going to get a chance to do that because we're going to wrap this episode up, and then we're going to come back next week, and we're going to talk. What do you want to talk about next week?
Muhammad Ali.
So we're going to talk boxing next week.
We're going to talk boxing.
All right.
Pittsburgh has a great boxing history. It was once one of the biggest boxing meccas in the country. Back in the 30s and 40s.
What's the best way? What's the best way for people to get a hold of you? Just the jimmyo@gmail.com?
Well, if anybody still has a phone book.
Give them the phone number if you want.
No, what I'm saying is I'm the only Jim O'Brien in the Pittsburgh phone book. My number is 412-221-3580. And I answer the phone unless it says spam on it. And I'll talk to you. And if you look up, the best thing you can do if you have a computer is to Google Pittsburgh sports author Jim O'Brien, and you will see all my books, pictures of the covers, summaries of the stories, and you'll be able to contact me. But in the future, you tune into this podcast with me and my friend Ben Fisher, The Big Fish.
Yeah, we're going to have you on a bunch of times.
We're going to do some more of these.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. So
tell your friends about it.
Thanks again for coming today, Jim. And we'll talk next week, a little bit of boxing. And thanks.
There was a boxing writer in Pittsburgh named Jim Jab.
It's a great boxing name.
Right.
Yeah.
Great boxing name, Jim Jab. So we'll do some sparring next week.
Awesome.
Bring your gloves.
Sounds good.
Thank you for listening to the Big Fish Cares podcast.